very broad scope, very deep, very manual technique oriented, and very narrow. So we're not looking to get complete coverage across an environment, but more looking to see how deep can we go without detection. So the objectives here for a red team exercise are different depending on if you're looking at it from the red team perspective or from the client perspective. On the red team side, we're looking to accurately simulate an attack by a sophisticated adversary. And that adversary is seeking to achieve what the business considers to be a nightmare scenario, and they're looking to do that without detection. Their end game may involve something that's obviously going to be detected eventually, such as loss of money, shutting down systems, ransomware, whatever it may be. But they're looking to get to that point without detection so that they can move into their end game. On the client side, they're looking to understand their resiliency to this style of an attack. And at the end of the day, what they're really looking to do is drive risk reduction. So they're not interested in specific technical vulnerabilities or attack techniques except insofar as it helps them to reduce their overall risk to this style of an attack. So this presentation is not focused on the technical aspects, the technical techniques that go into a red team exercise, but rather, how do we plan for success? How do we make sure that we've done all of the right planning ahead of time so that we can set up this exercise from the very beginning to have the best chance of being successful as defined by both the red team members and those on the client security team. So a few key principles here. The first is hyperrealism, which means that in order to evaluate their resiliency to attack, we have to actually attack them, and we have to attack them in the most realistic way possible. Obviously, the corollary to that is we're not going to take the final step of actually causing harm to the business. So, hyperrealism while doing no harm. This means we get to the point where we could push the button to cause some form of destruction, some form of damage to the business, but we don't actually do it. We don't actually steal the money or disable the brakes on the mineshaft elevator or whatever the case may be. As we go along, there are two other principles here of zero knowledge and zero notice. I'll go into those more in detail later, but essentially the zero knowledge refers to the red team's perspective on this engagement. They have zero knowledge about the environment that they're attacking, about where the assets are that they're looking to compromise, and about the security controls that are in place. They're essentially given, here is your target, here is the objective that you're looking to achieve. Zero notice is the other side of that coin. It refers to the security operations team and their knowledge of the assessment. They receive zero notice that this attack simulation is going to occur. As far as they know, this is a real attack. There's a real adversary out there, and until the end of the engagement, they are kept in the dark about the fact that this is an authorized, legitimate attack against their environment. And this feeds back into the hyperrealism. If we don't have the zero knowledge and the zero notice components, we lose a lot of the realism. So a number of key considerations that go into planning this style of a technical assessment. We'll walk through each of these in more detail, but just at a high level here, we'll look at the scenario, we'll look at how we design a campaign plan to achieve those objectives, the scope of the assessment, what types of attacks to include, the rules of engagement, how do we conduct ourselves as a professional adversary simulator during the engagement, and what's the overall mode of communication with the client, and what's the escalation plan that we put in place for the various contingencies that we need to account for. Starting off with the adversary scenario here. The first principle is that we're keeping this at a business level. This means that we are not looking to have a scenario objective of compromise a domain administrator account. Think of it from the CEO or the CFO's perspective. They likely don't know or care what a domain administrator is. we're looking for something that they will understand. And this is going to vary from industry to industry and from client to client within that industry. So we want to define who would be interested in attacking this business. The adversary interested in compromising a web hosting company is going to be very different from the adversary who's seeking to undermine a gold mining company. Both of those would be different from the adversary who's primarily interested in targeting a financial institution. So first, who is going to attack this particular company? The close follow-on is why. What is their motivation? And this is going to vary depending on the adversary and depending on the client as well. So it may be straight up financial motivation. It may be that there's a political component of either a nation-state sponsored adversary or a hacktivist group. It may be a less sophisticated attacker that is simply doing this for the thrill or to make a statement or bragging rights. But it's important to understand why, because that defines what a realistic attack is going to look like. Realistic compared to what? What is the adversary that this client should be most concerned about? What would the impact be to the client if this adversary were successful in their attack? If they achieved their intent, what would the impact to the client be? And what is the adversary's specific objective? Now, only after we've answered those first three questions do we start to look at a more specific level. And again, this is not a technical objective, but a business objective. What is the type of data or the type of system that they're looking to compromise? So not, can I get on database server 231, but can I access plain text cardholder information in any form from any system anywhere in the enterprise? The adversary doesn't care much where it comes from, and so you lose realism if you define it too narrowly. Finally, what's the starting point for this type of an assessment? Are we looking at an insider threat where the adversary already has access to the internal network and some level of credentials? Or are we looking at an external adversary who first needs to breach the perimeter, set up that foothold on the internal network, and then become an insider threat, so to speak? So a few different client concerns here, and for each of those, I'll go through the client concerns and some items that we're trying to avoid here. For the adversary scenario, the concerns are usually around these two items. First, well, I need to check the boxes. There's a regulation, there's a client, my management had told me that I need to do an external test, an internal test, test this application, and a wireless assessment. Our response is usually, that's fine, we'll do that, but don't limit yourself to that. Instead, wrap all of those specific attack techniques into the context of a broader adversary simulation so that you can get the benefits of that broader assessment while still checking the boxes and keeping the regulators happy. Another one is simply that they don't see themselves as a target for this style of an attack. And regardless of what industry they're in, this is a process of walking them through who would be interested in attacking that industry. Because even if they don't feel that they're a target for that attack, as we've seen more and more from the high-profile breaches, they may be a target, or they may be a Home Depot, or they may be any other type of entity that has something of value to the adversary. We want to avoid defining only those IT objectives, and we want to avoid dilution of effort. This means an adversary coming back to us and saying, well, I've got these half-dozen different objectives that I want you to achieve. The problem is if you're doing, say, a 6-week engagement and you have 6 different objectives, you're going to be simulating 6 different adversaries who are only willing to spend a week each attacking the enterprise. What's more deadly, and what we urge our clients to consider, is more focus on the one adversary that matters the most, who's willing to devote 6 weeks of effort. Focus on that one assessment, and then maybe consider others down the road. So once the adversary scenario has been defined and agreed upon, next you move into the campaign plan to achieve the objectives. And I know this is an election year, but we're not talking about a plan to get elected here. It's an attack campaign, the offensive campaign. Few key principles on this one. First, be creative. Anything that the adversary can do should be in scope here. If the adversary can attack from the internet, you include that in scope. If the adversary can send a malicious email, that's included. Can they pick up the phone and call an employee? Yes. Can they identify some dirt on an employee and use that to coerce them? Yes, but there we run into the question of legality and ethics. There are obviously lines that we as an adversary or as a simulated adversary can't cross, but what you can do is simulate that those have been effective. So for example, we've gone through engagements where we've identified given individuals, reached out to the client and said, this individual has information out on LinkedIn that identifies them as a likely target. Based on other sources, we've identified that this individual might be susceptible, not questioning their ethics in any form, but simply there are some leverage points that may be available. Then we reach out to the client and say, let's simulate that this had occurred, not with this particular employee, but with someone in this role within the organization. If that person decided to turn against you, how effective would they be operating in conjunction with an external adversary? So if they provide everything that they know and everything that they have access to the adversary, how much easier would it be for the adversary to bring down the organization at that point? Be adaptive. This means that we don't have a single attack pathway in mind when we first start out in the engagement. In that 6-week engagement I mentioned, we don't know in week 4, we don't know in week 1 what we're going to be doing in week 4. We let it evolve organically. We know what attack techniques we have at our disposal, and we know how we're going to adapt as we move along, but we let it evolve organically and adapt to the conditions on the ground, so to speak. Again, hyperrealism. The adversary is going to adapt. The adversary is not going to say, well, there's a larger attack surface over here, but we also need to make sure that we do this wireless test, so we're going to stop this fruitful attack in order to move over to this area. That doesn't make sense. It's not realistic. So instead, let the red team follow their nose, so to speak, and adjust where they're going to spend their time based on the available attack surface. Finally, be resilient. In conjunction with the zero notice principle, this means that the blue team, the security operations team who's defending against this simulated attack, is going to be countering your efforts. So make sure that your attack takes that into account. If, for example, we have 3 different attack techniques of external network, physical on-site compromise and planting a device on the network, and social engineering via spear phishing. Plan for some of these to fail, plan for some of them to be detected, and ensure that there's no infrastructure shared between those different techniques, so that if 2 out of 3 are detected and eradicated, you still have that 3rd. From the response perspective, if you remove 2/3 of an adversary's access to the environment, you've failed. So we want to ensure that we have the ability to retain that 3rd mode of access. So client concerns. First, simply, I don't think I can approve a physical breach or calling an employee or any of these other things. What that usually says is that you're too far down in the organization. You're not discussing the assessment at a sufficiently high executive level in order for them to understand the risk-reward trade-off here. These engagements are never without risk to the organization. There's always the chance that something could go wrong. We manage that when we get into the rules of engagement later, but you have to have someone who's willing to take on a certain amount of risk in order to reap the reward of doing an adversary simulation. Second, we know someone will click that link. This is in regards to the social engineering, the spear phishing component. This is usually an indicator that they're not thinking of the type of spear phishing assessment that we would include in an adversary simulation. We're not looking to send out 1,000 messages and see who clicks the link, because that's very noisy. It raises the profile, and it's almost certainly going to be noticed and blocked by the blue team. What we're looking at is if we send exactly the right email, and we send it to 1 or 2 people, and they click the link, are the technical controls in place to respond effectively? Well, first, to detect that that's occurred, and to respond effectively. And are the procedural controls in place in order to quickly take a system offline, understand the indicators of compromise, understand where else that same foothold might be in the environment, and so on. So we're not looking at, will someone click the link or not? We know there's always someone who's going to click the link. We're looking at the compensating controls at a technical and procedural level with the assumption that someone will click the link. We want to avoid fragmented offensive campaigns. This means that we're not looking at this as first an external assessment, then an internal assessment, then a spear phishing assessment, then a wireless assessment. It's one attack campaign with different attack techniques. So as we move along, it's going to go organically from one phase into the next. If we're doing the external assessment, and we're expecting to spend some amount of time on this, and 1/4 of the way through the anticipated time, we get access to a server and we realize that this server has access to the internal environment, we're immediately transitioning to an internal assessment. It's all part of the same attack campaign. And we want to avoid overly specific plans. We've had times where more regulated clients or clients who are extremely risk adverse want us to document exactly what our attack plan is. On this day, we're going to be trying these types of attacks. On that day, we're going to be trying these types of attacks. We can't do that. If that's what the particular client wants, that means they're not really looking for an adversary simulation, because you lose a large amount of the realism if your plans are overly specific. Next, looking at the scope. For the scope, we want to think globally and strike precisely. Thinking globally means that we're looking at the enterprise as a whole. Again, hyper-realism. If the adversary can identify that you have a branch office that you don't care much about compared to your corporate headquarters, and the security controls are weaker there, the physical controls are weaker there, and it's possible to, say, pick a lock after hours and plant something on the network, then it's completely legitimate for us to include that as well. Once we plug something into the network there, then we can move laterally, identify which systems on the headquarters network are accessible from this branch office, pivot through those deeper and deeper into the environment. Similarly, we don't want the client to say, here are the 10 systems that I really care about. These are the assets that contain the data that you're trying to compromise. Limit your scope to these. 95% of the time, those systems are well secured because they're understood to be high-value assets. Attacking those head-on is not going to work. Instead, we're looking for that forgotten development server somewhere that was stood up on a whim for testing and remains on the network, is not part of any asset spreadsheet, but is out there and is vulnerable and maybe on the domain. And if we compromise that, we get a domain account, and our level of access snowballs from there as we escalate privileges and move laterally across the enterprise. Eventually, we get to the point where we have this very broad and deep level of access. We have access to domain administrator accounts. Yes, we target them, but that's not the end objective. We may have access to SSH keys that provide access to a majority of the Unix environment, whatever it may be. Once we have this access, then it's time to strike precisely. And this means going after the end objective, going then to the assets containing the data we care about, but we're then coming in as an authorized user, essentially. We have the right credentials. All we have to do is ask nicely, and we're granted access to those systems. Client concerns. Availability is usually the largest one. If I give you this full authorization to attack any component of my enterprise, I'm not going to know where you're attacking, and I'm not going to know what concerns those system owners may have about those going offline. Our response to that is usually, if we can easily knock over a system through our type of very manual white glove testing, then that's a huge finding in and of itself. But really, at the end of the day, it comes down to trust. It comes down to what is their level of confidence in your team's ability to operate carefully in this environment. So in order to do these types of assessments and gain that level of trust, what we found is that it really needs to be an all-senior team of technical experts who have a very robust, broad experience in offensive security and know with a very high level of confidence what's going to happen at each step of the way, so that they can make that risk-reward decision at each point along the way, knowing that if I go to this next step, I might get closer to the objective, but it might do something that is going to affect system stability, so I need to go in another direction. The second concern is I don't actually own my infrastructure, and this is becoming more and more common as we see organizations move to cloud-based systems. So in some cases, this is easy to address. If you have a client with a portion of their infrastructure hosted in AWS or Azure or any of those similar environments, there's a structured process for getting authorization to attack those systems on behalf of the client. So we can usually go through that process, get the authorization, and include that as part of the global scope of the assessment. Sometimes there's a hosting provider that just won't work with you on that, and in that case, there's really not much you can do other than document that there is a whole lack of visibility around this component. What the client should be doing ahead of time is when they're negotiating the agreements with these vendors, is ensuring that they have the right to audit clause in their contract so that when they come and ask for the authorization to attack that environment, it's really a formality. The vendor has already agreed to let them do it. They're just looking for specific approval in this instance. Things we want to avoid. We want to avoid limiting the engagement to only the areas that the client thinks are important. So I mentioned the example of these are the systems that we care about. We also want to avoid letting them even influence the assessment that much. What we prefer is to get access to the internal environment, find the knowledge repositories, the wikis, the SharePoint sites, and explore those on our own to find references to the type of data that we care about. Again, this goes back to that zero knowledge principle. How easy is it to find? There are interesting artifacts that come out of that type of exploration, such as, are there sites out there on your intranet that contain information pointing to the critical data stores? Is that properly, are there proper authentication and authorization controls around that? Sometimes, in an extreme example, we've even seen domain administrator credentials on internal SharePoint sites. And those are the types of things that we wouldn't have found if we weren't operating from a zero knowledge perspective, needing to do that level of discovery ourselves. We want to avoid whitelisting only certain subnets. There will be times when a client comes to us and says, we know these systems will fall over if you touch them. We'll blacklist those. But there's a difference between saying, this small set of systems is out of scope, and saying, you can only operate in this circle. Rules of engagement. 4 key principles here, all of which go back to the hyperrealism. First, the red team autonomy. We need to allow the red team the agility to operate in this manner, as we've been discussing here. This includes things like having this 24/7 window, understanding that they will have access to sensitive data, but making sure that the proper protocols are in place as to how they're going to handle the sensitive data when they gain access. So a note on the 24/7 window. Yes, this means operating in your production environment during business hours. We've been on our clients' financial systems of record, money movement systems, and so on during business hours. We've been on mine operation systems while the mine is actually operating. If an adversary could do that, so can we. So it goes back to that foundational principle. This makes a lot of clients very uneasy because it does mean that we have access to everything. If they have mergers and acquisitions data, especially if that's part of the data that's been defined as a component of the objective, we will likely have access to that. We will likely have access to their executives' emails. As we go through and compromise workstations, we'll data mine everything that's on those workstations. If an employee has put sensitive information on that workstation, if they have personal photos on there, we may well see those. We're operating as an adversary there. So it comes down to the level of professionalism that they expect from the red team and recognizing that they are granting a very broad level of authorization here to target them. So then, how do you avoid creating essentially a reportable incident? If we're accessing personal information, electronic personal health information, materially non-public information about the company's financial performance, whatever it may be, essentially this all goes back to having the right legal agreements in place. So I'm definitely not a lawyer, but make sure that you have a lawyer involved at this process. There are things that can be done to officially grant authorization as a business associate or other form of formal recognition of the role that you're playing so that the client is authorizing you to see this data as part of their business operations, even if they're not provisioning you with access to that data. Again, we're avoiding any unrealistic limitation. Could the adversary attack you on Christmas when they know that your A-team is likely home with their families and you've got a more junior crew on staff and fewer than you normally would? Yes, the adversary could. So yes, we can do that as well. We've actually had clients explicitly ask us, please attack us on Christmas, because we want to know how we'd hold up. We want to know if we have sufficient staffing and sufficient skills in place so that we can defend against this style of an attack, even if we are attacked on Christmas. The last thing you want to do is get stuck in what I call specific pre-approval hell. This means that as part of your rules of engagement, you are required to get pre-authorization for every exploit that you conduct. So you find a system on the network, you've identified a given vulnerability, and you need to go back to the client to ask, may I exploit this vulnerability? You then exploit that, and you see, oh, I'm running as system on this workstation. May I retrieve password hashes? May I attempt to crack those password hashes? You can see very quickly that this bogs you down. It means that you've lost a lot of the realism simply because you've made the whole process take 10 times as long as you go back and forth with the client. And they're then wondering, can I authorize this? Do I need to ask somebody else first? Instead, define it up front. Define it explicitly in your rules of engagement that you are not going to be asking for specific pre-approval, but that you will be compromising systems, deploying offensive technologies, cracking passwords, reusing compromised accounts, and any other specific attack techniques that you want to include there. Get agreement on those and have notification procedures in place, but not pre-approval required. And that gets into the communication and escalation plan. This is really around maintaining that zero notice posture as regards the internal blue team, the security operations team. First, from the very beginning, when you are first discussing this type of engagement, ensure that the client knows to keep this on a need-to-know basis. We're usually proposing this assessment to the CISO or the CIO or sometimes even the CEO or board of directors, depending on the level that is concerned about their attack resiliency. From that first conversation, we will recommend that they only share knowledge that they're even talking to us with the minimum number of people who really need to be in the loop here. Because if the blue team gets wind that there's going to be this style of an attack, you've lost a lot of your realism. The objective is explicitly to keep SecOps in the dark. So they think this is a real attack like any other real attack, and they go through their normal response procedures so that we can evaluate and comment and recommend ways to improve those detection and response procedures. What we're really trying to do here is test that response effectiveness. So as an example, there was a time when we're attacking as an external adversary. We identify a system that is accessible from the internet, never should have been accessible from the internet, has Tomcat Manager on there with default credentials. We access the console, we deploy a web application backdoor, and they have a host-based IPS that detects that backdoor and sends up a flag and creates an event in their security operations center. There's a junior analyst going through the queue who sees this alert that there was malware detected on a server. The IPS noted that this malware had been quarantined and cleaned and the status was green and no further action was required. The analyst closed the ticket and went to the next item in the queue with no further thought. On our side, we noticed what had happened, that we uploaded this backdoor, but it wasn't there. We modified our payload, packed it in a different way, and used a different command and control channel. Uploaded it again, and this time it worked, and that compromised system provided the single pivot point necessary to go from the internet to full access to the majority of their internal network. So this was a process failure. They had the technical capability to detect that initial backdoor that we uploaded. And it worked. It was detected, but the response was not effective. That analyst should have asked, why is there malware on this system? This is a server. This is not something where somebody's going to get malware through opening an email or a drive-by download or anything like that. If there's malware on this system, this means that somebody has administrative access to that system. That's a problem. That should have triggered a full incident response investigation. If the security operations team had known that this was an exercise, there's a very high likelihood that when confronted, they would have said, well, yes, we knew there was an exercise going on. So we would have identified a process failure there that would have been reported as a non-finding because the operations team has this legitimate explanation of, we never followed up on this further because we knew it was an exercise. So if you maintain the hyperrealism, you have a much better capability to evaluate the detection and response controls. We do have clients that don't want their security operations team tied up responding to this. What if there was a real attack that occurs during the time frame that we're doing this adversary simulation? Similarly, they'll have concerns around availability. What happens if there's an availability incident? How do I know whether or not it's related to what you're doing? This goes back to having a single point of contact that's highly enough placed in the organization so that they can see what's going on. So someone who has the awareness of the availability command center or whatever team is responsible for availability of systems, someone who has high enough visibility to see what the security operations team is doing, so that they can then make the decision on a case-by-case basis to determine how do I weigh the relative benefits and relative concerns of, first, wanting to maintain the realism of the assessment, and second, needing to be agile on the corporation side and determine at a certain point, no, this is bad. We're actually under attack. We need all hands on deck dealing with the real incident. We're going to pull the plug on the adversary simulation, end that exercise, notify the security team that that was an exercise so that we can focus on this real malicious attack. We've seen that happen. It's pretty rare, but we need to make sure that we have all of this documented ahead of time. So we want to avoid data leakage to the SecOps team, anything that would indicate that this is only an exercise. So the operations of the red team need to be done with this in mind. So there should be nothing in the tradecraft of the red team that indicates that this is a drill. There should be nothing referencing the name of the company who's performing the red team assessment. There should be nothing that looks like this is just part of a simulation. It should look authentic. It should cause some level of fear in the security operations team that they are under a real malicious attack. We want to avoid premature termination of the exercise. This means that that point of contact needs to be coached so that when they have somebody on the security operations team who comes to them and says, we've detected this anomaly here, we've noticed that there was a back door on this system and we've pulled it offline and we believe the problem's solved, that point of contact should not immediately respond with, oh, good job, we had an exercise, you detected it, it looks like everything's good. Because what's normally happened is by that point we've moved on to other systems in the organization. And we have multiple back doors, multiple command and control channels into the environment, and we want to let that response run its course. If the security operations team declares success, declares eradication of our red team access into the environment, but we still have access to one or more systems, there's something wrong. Because that means that if this was a malicious attack, they're going to shut down their incident response process while they're still being attacked in a stealthy, covert manner by a malicious adversary. That's a problem. So we want to take all of that into account in planning for the communications and the escalation process with the client and with that primary point of contact. As a side note, that primary point of contact is usually someone outside of the security operations team so that they don't have that inherent conflict of interest. It's usually someone who is at the executive level or a designated lieutenant of the CISO, for example. So once we have this all planned out, what are the guidelines for the actual execution of the engagement? The first principle is to be strategic. Recognize that only an executive is likely to have the authority to approve this plan. So if you're not talking to an executive in the organization, you're likely not going to be able to do a full realistic adversary simulation because all of those various competing client concerns will win out over the realism of the assessment. And some executives don't have the confidence to approve this. They're not willing to put a stake in the ground and say, yes, we are going to do this because we know that we're going to be attacked eventually, and we want to know how prepared we are. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, that technical compromise doesn't matter if you can't show business impact. So find what it is that the executive team will understand. That's usually, especially in a public corporation, what is going to affect the stock price if it hits the front page of the New York Times? What is there that is going to directly affect the bottom line, have a material impact on the business? Second, be deliberate. Stay focused. Stay focused on the objective. There have been times where we've had to politely chew out a member of the red team with less experience when they identify and compromise a system and they're very proud of themselves. They've found and exploited a high-risk finding. But it doesn't get us access that we didn't already have. And so it's not very realistic. It's not accurately modeling a sophisticated adversary. If we had credentials to log into this system, why would we run an exploit here and raise our likelihood of detection? We never know with 100% certainty what the security controls are that are in place. So stay focused on the end objective. Remember your OPSEC. Remember to avoid cross-contamination between different avenues of attack. Don't use the same command and control server for your Dropbox that was placed on the network through a physical attack and your spear phishing campaign that sends out something from a PowerShell embedded in an Office macro. You don't want detection of one to result in detection of all of the others. Keep that objective in mind. Stay laser focused on that objective. Think globally, but when thinking globally, remember to only strike when you know that you can strike precisely. And evaluate that risk reward. There's always a trade-off. There's always, every action you take is going to raise the potential for detection. Know that. Know the tools. Know what the tools do. Know what the tools look like on the wire. Know what your manual techniques look like on the wire. Test your payloads, your techniques against the various detective security controls so that you know you can make an intelligent decision at each and every step. If I undertake this attack technique, how much does this raise my likelihood of detection, and what new access does it give me that I didn't have before? Then you can make an intelligent decision about whether to engage in that attack versus any of the half dozen others that you might be able to try. Finally, be agile, adaptive, and opportunistic. Don't get too focused on this potential 0 day that you might have found over here that you really want to keep digging into because it's fascinating. If that's your best way in, sure, go for it. But if there's a window unlocked over here, don't waste hours trying to pick this very complex lock on the front door. The real adversary is going to take the path of least resistance, so we should do likewise. Thank you. Any questions? Yes. Do we have a microphone?
So how do you handle cases like, let's say, the mining company, where the prescribed reaction to a threat against a certain set of boxes is to essentially shut down large portions of the operation? And since the red team is operating with zero knowledge, they may not have yet discovered the map of what this server controls versus what this other server controls. So they're looking at a compromise and they think it's just some random server, but it turns out to be something that controls like the power plant. And the response is to shut down that server and shut down the mine. And you have this cascading thing that causes real impact. How do you manage that?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's if our primary objective involves some sort of causing a denial of service, how do we test that when we may not know the full impact of the systems that we're affecting?
No, it's more along the lines of that it's not that you cause harm in of yourself, it's that the reaction of the blue team is extreme.
Right.
And it's something that maybe you even know about what their standard reactions are, but you don't know you've hit that sensitive spot.
Right. So there are usually two criteria that we define in our rules of engagement that affect the decision of do we or do we not inform the blue team that this is an exercise. The first criteria is the security operations team about to involve law enforcement? Is it going to go outside the confines of the organization? And the second is the response process about to in any way impact business operations? So that would fall into that second category. And that's really on that point of contact who's monitoring the blue team, monitoring the security operations team to make a judgment call. So if there's a single user workstation that has been detected as compromised, it's usually going to be worth the risk of business disruption to pull that workstation offline, image it, issue that user a clean workstation, even though it does result in a loss of productivity for that one user, because it is worth that expense in order to reap the benefits of having the more realistic full attack simulation. However, when we start looking at a response where the next step involves shutting down a server, or, I mean, we've had organizations where someone on the response team proposes, we don't know how deep this has gone. We know that they're on the system that is the last hop before we send out wire transfer instructions to the Fedwire system. And their next step would be to disconnect that system from Fedwire, cut that connection, and all of a sudden none of their clients are able to conduct business through their system. That's the point at which they call end exercise. Don't actually shut that system off. Here's what's going on. And then at that point it moves more to a tabletop of what would our next steps be if this were a real attack. And it's often very revealing because usually the clients haven't fully thought through if this critical system is compromised, and if it's not a drill, if it's a malicious adversary, how do we make that business decision? How do you evaluate whether you're going to shut down a critical system that's required for your business operations versus allowing an attack to continue? Either way is damaging to the business. And either way, there's a lot of risk, and somebody's going to question the decision that you made afterwards. And so it's usually very enlightening for our clients to need to be faced with that decision as part of a drill before they need to face it as part of a malicious attack. Other questions? Yes?
Hey, how often are you able to get clients to execute a perfect red team?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
How often do you get clients where you are able to execute a perfect red team exercise like you're describing? And apart from executive buy-in, what else? What are the other factors which help in getting that perfect red team exercise?
Well, budget is an obvious one. Of simply having the financial resources to commit to this type of exercise. In terms of how often we do it, that's really what we focus on. That within FusionX, that is our specialty. That is what our team has been purpose-built for. So essentially, if a given client is not wanting to do that type of an assessment, they'll go somewhere else with a more junior team where they'll pay less money to get the type of assessment that they're looking for. So if a client works with us, it's really because they want that full-on adversary simulation in order to understand the ability to prevent, detect, and respond. So with that framing, I'd say that probably greater than 95% of our assessments are the full no-holds-barred attack simulations.
Okay, yeah, it's time to wrap it up. So let's give another round of big applause to Sean. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you. And just one final note, if this sounds like something you want to be doing, please talk to me, because we are absolutely looking to expand our team. Thank you.
Thanks again to Sean, and on behalf of BSides and our sponsor Fitbit, I want to present you with a Fitbit.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.